All right. You guys have a seat. I love you guys. All right. We are having a few technical difficulties tonight, but I just want to use that opportunity to say we have the greatest production team of all time. Can you guys give it up for all of our production team, volunteer staff? You guys are amazing. None of this would be possible without you guys. So, from those of you on cameras to those of you in the booth, we love you guys so much. Y'all are amazing. City Hope Youth, are y'all ready for week 3 of Where There's Smoke, There's Fire? Y'all ready? Okay. This series has honestly been one of my favorite series of all time. We've learned so much. It's been such an amazing series. We learned in the first week how the Spirit of God guides us and directs us and leads us. We learned in the second week, last week, how the Spirit of God actually protects us, that God's Spirit, that God desires to protect us in every walk of our life. And this week we're going to talk about how the Spirit of God actually consumes us. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But before I do that, usually I tell something embarrassing about myself in my messages. But this week, I actually want to tell an embarrassing story about my little brother. Some of you guys have met him. He lives in Mississippi, but he comes to camp with us sometimes. So maybe you guys have met Braden before. But what a lot of people don't know about Braden is he had this weird obsession when he was little. And this obsession was with a guy named Justin Bieber. Y'all know Bieber, right? Okay. Yeah, this is little Bieber. This is before the tattoos, before the craziness. This is the flippy hair Bieber. How many of y'all remember flippy hair Bieber? Okay. Now I'm gonna tell you one time, baby Bieber, right? This Justin Bieber, and this started as something small. We had a Christmas CD that was Justin Bieber that he loved, the little drummer boy song. And then it went a little further, and he wanted a poster of Justin Bieber, which was a little weird. But he was like 4, right? So it was cute. We were like, oh, this is cool. So we got him a poster, and then he asked for Christmas one year. He wanted the Barbie Justin Bieber dream set, bus, whatever, right? Crazy. At this point, I was like, this is a little much. I had a picture for you, but I don't want to embarrass him too much. It got to the point where this boy dyed his hair purple because Justin Bieber's hair was purple. I'm not kidding you. And this love for Justin Bieber, this fandom that he had was so great that it consumed everything. His hair color changed because he was so consumed with Justin Bieber. And this is a funny thing, but I believe that we also have things in our life that if we're not careful will completely consume us. That may start off as something small, may start off as just a little hobby or something that we enjoy to do, or maybe it's just a little thing that we like to do for fun that if we're not careful can consume everything in our lives. And regardless of the hobby or the thing that we do, we have this consistency to become consumed by the things that we love. And so my question for you tonight is, what consumes you? And I don't want us to think this is just for sin. There are good things that if we're not careful can become not good things because they consume our lives and take the place that God is called to hold in our lives. So what consumes your personality? What consumes your identity, your character? Is it maybe what is the if I were to ask you, who are you as a person, or what is your personality? What would you tell me? Would the first thing that you said have something to do with your relationship with Jesus? And sometimes I think we do this, and it's not a bad thing, but we would say, man, I'm a soccer player, or man, I'm in the band, and these things are not necessarily bad, and those answers are not bad, but our heart posture with those questions is important. And the reason that this is so important is because how you define yourself will often determine what you give the most attention to. And on the flip side, what you give the most attention to will oftentimes determine how you define yourself. And I want to be clear, because what you do is not who you are, but what you spend the most time doing will always attribute to who you are becoming. And so tonight I want to ask you, are the things that you spend the most of your time doing leading you closer to Christ or further away from Christ? The sport that you're involved in, that's not a bad thing. Honestly, most of you guys, God is using you in that moment. The clubs that you're in, the sports that you're a part of, being a part of band and the clubs that you're in at school, I've heard stories God is using you in mighty ways where you're introducing people to Jesus and you're witnessing to your friends in those areas when, you're out there and you've got the eye black with John 3:16. Like, you're letting your relationship with Jesus be in those moments. And this shows that you're consumed with Jesus so much that He's leading you in those areas. Are you consumed? Are the things in your life leading you closer to Christ or further away from him? But there's also a third option. Are the things that you do in your life causing you to be stagnant? See, I believe that the enemy would love us to believe that there's only two options. He would love us to believe that as long as we're not going back, that it's okay that we're not going forward. But I want to tell you tonight that a stagnancy in this area can be just as damaging to your relationship with Jesus as going backwards. I want to talk to you about this stagnancy before we continue tonight, because like I said, the enemy would love for us to believe this. Last week, I told you guys about how it took me a long time to learn how to swim. Me and water don't have a good relationship. My biggest fear is the ocean. Do we have anybody else who's scared of the ocean? I'm one of those, like, I'll put my ankles in the water at the beach, but that's about it. Little things called sharks live in there, and me and them don't get along. And so I try to stay away from the ocean, but my fear of the ocean has also led to a fascination with what lies beneath the surface in the ocean. And one of the things that I've just been weirdly fascinated with is aquatic life, and specifically sharks. Anybody like Shark Week? Shark Week, okay. So just to give you guys, just to nerd out, give you a little lesson on sharks really quick. There are certain types of sharks like great whites, whale sharks, mako sharks that have this thing with their gills and their pharynx, which is basically just a membrane that's under their gills. I'm not going to nerd on you. You don't need to know that. There's a thing in their throat area that helps them to breathe. It soaks up the oxygen as they swim. It goes through their gills and it helps them breathe. But the thing that's really cool about this is that these type of sharks that I just mentioned have to continuously swim in order to stay breathing. And so what that means in that pharynx, sometimes it can be almost a placeholder for oxygen for a moment if they stop for a second. But God created them to be in constant movement in order to survive. And the way that scientists discovered this is they found sharks that were dead on the ocean floor, and they didn't know how this was happening. There weren't any damages. It didn't look like they'd been in a fight. There weren't any organs messed up. They were just dead. And they discovered that these types of sharks, these different species that we talked about, actually have to stay in consistent swimming, consistent flow, or they would eventually become unconscious because they would stop breathing, they would suffocate, they would die, and they would sink to the bottom. And I tell you this not because I want to give you a science class tonight, because I believe for a lot of you, your faith is similar to this. That when you start this walk with Jesus, he calls you to be in a continuous motion towards him. And I say this because I believe that the enemy has convinced a lot of you that as long as you're not who you used to be, you're okay. And there's some truth to that, but I also want to tell you that God's calling you further. God's calling you deeper. God's calling you closer to himself tonight. And I want to warn you guys tonight about the stagnancy of your faith, because you can survive a short while without moving, just like these sharks. But if you try to remain in the same place too long, you'll find yourself beginning to sink. And eventually your relationship with him will fade, and you will lose spiritual consciousness to the point where you wonder, is my faith even real? Is this thing that I built my life on even real? We use the consciousness that we have in our faith. And a lot of times it's things in our schedule that will cause us to be stagnant. Things that we could say, my schedule's so busy, I have so much going on. I've got school, I've got sports, I've got clubs, I have my relationship with my girlfriend and my boyfriend that I have to keep up. I have all of these things that I'm trying to balance. And I want to be clear, I'm not telling you to quit your sports teams or quit your clubs. I think God calls us to have those things, to be a witness in some areas, and God calls us to some of those hard things. But maybe one of those things is that, and maybe your follow-up for tonight is having a conversation with your small group leader and letting them help you with this, or talking to your parent about something that you're struggling with in that way. But I do think that anything that keeps us from him should be evaluated in our life. Anything that keeps us from God consistently in your life should be evaluated. And what this will do when you have this evaluation in yourself is it will make you stop believing the lie that you don't have enough time. How many of you ever said, I don't have time to do that right now. I don't have time to read my Bible. I don't have time to pray. I don't have time to do those things. And for some of you, that may very well be true, but I know for myself and for a lot of us in this room, if we were to check our screen time, we'd realize very quickly we got a lot more time than we'd want to admit, right? If we were to look at how much time we spend doing this, we'd realize that we've got a lot of time left. And what this does is this makes it impossible. We can't blame our stagnancy on our lack of pursuit in him, that there's a part that we play in this equation. But I'm going to get off that for a minute, and we're going to continue forward with the story tonight. So how do we ensure that we don't find ourselves sinking? How do we ensure that we don't get into this place of stagnancy and sinking to the bottom? We ask ourselves this simple question tonight. What has your heart? What has your heart? And if you're asking yourself this question and that question makes you sad or disappointed in yourself, I want to let you know that we have a God who is full of grace and love for you, a God that is relentless in his pursuit of you. And I want to show you a story tonight from a man who was running from God, a man who had lost sight of what God had called him to be, a man who we actually see God meet him in the midst of his mess and in the middle of a wilderness season of his life. We're reading in Exodus 3. We're going to start in verse 1. If you have your Bibles tonight, you can flip there. Exodus 3. This man's name is Moses. It says, one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire in the middle of the bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it did not burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go and see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, here I am. And Moses replied, do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid and ashamed to look at God. So here's Moses. Here's this man that we read earlier in this series was called to deliver the people of God, who was chosen by God to be someone who would take his people out of the bondage and the slavery that they were in and be led into the promised land that God had for them. But we see Moses in this vulnerable state as he had done something in his life that he wasn't too proud of, come to a place that when faced with God's presence, he hides his face in shame. And I don't know about you, but I can relate to Moses. There have been times in my life where I'm in God's presence, where I'm standing in a worship moment, and I can see everybody around me experiencing God's presence and wonder, why don't I have that? Why can't I find that? Why do I feel this shame? Why do I feel this way in my walk with Christ? Why don't I feel that same experience? And we see that as this bush is burning, that God was using the burning of this bush to catch Moses' attention, to realign his heart with himself. The first thing we see is that the bush was on fire without anything being around it. There's no one around. There's nothing that would have caused this fire other than God. We see that God catches him in this moment where it doesn't make sense. And the second and the most obvious thing is that the bush was continuously burning without being burnt up. How many of you have ever started a fire? You know that if a fire catches something, you know it's probably going to burn that thing up, right? If you've ever thrown, I don't know, maybe a pizza box or something into a fire. Homeschoolers, who was at our homeschool party? Just a little, okay, we love that. Well, y'all get a little sneak peek of that next week. But you know that a fire consumes everything in its path. It burns everything up. But this bush and this ball of fire in this moment wasn't burned up. But we see God's usage of this imagery here, and he's teaching us an important lesson, and it's this, that he will use the fire of his presence to bring us closer to him. His presence consumed the bush, and in this moment caught the attention of Moses. And just as it was for this bush, how much more will God use the fire of his presence to catch your attention? To grab onto you in those moments of wilderness seasons, to grab on to your heart when you want to do nothing else but turn your head in shame. And God, even in this moment, says, Moses, I want to speak to you. Moses, I've called you. Moses, I have a plan for you. Moses, I know what you did, and that's okay, and we're going to get past that, and we're going to deal with that. But man, I've got a plan for you. I've called you to something greater. And in this moment, God's presence through the fire reveals this. I'm going to read you guys a verse in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 4:23 and 24 says, be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God has made with you. Do not make yourselves an idol in the form of anything to the Lord your God has forbidden. The Lord your God is a consuming fire. He is a jealous God. Our God is a consuming fire, and God's presence can consume us. God uses this physical thing as a mark of his presence. And now we know that we don't have a burning bush, even though sometimes I'm like, God, I wish you would do something crazy like that in front of me that I can see. But he gives us something better. He gives us the Holy Spirit as a guide, as a director, as a presence that can consume every part of your lives. I think too often we get convinced that we can somehow compartmentalize our relationship with Jesus, and we can be a Christian on Wednesday and Sunday and be a different person other days out of the week. But I want to tell you tonight that God wants to consume every part of your life. That when you truly begin to follow Jesus, when you truly allow his spirit to lead you in their life, there's no part of your life that can remain untouched.